This next section looks kind of at some very specific factors in spoilage and shelf life. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail with some of them, but you can kind of think about some of these on your own too, and think about why one food would be more likely to spoil, or what are a lot of the factors that would make it very specific. And so looking at something like meat, during the actual meat processing, uh, steps that are taking place. I really don't know them very well personally. I don't eat a lot of meat, but there's a lot of chopping and grinding, and these are areas where they're going to increase surface area. So I mentioned in the last section about ground meat and how there's a lot more surfaces. During the process, though, even if you're trying to, you're not making ground beef, a lot of times just with the getting of the meat off the animal, sometimes other things may come along with it, like part of the intestine where you might find a lot of bacteria. And so that can accidentally be introduced during the cutting process. Handling, distribution during these temperatures, the amount of microbes that are able to grow and to be passed on can be very different in a lot of different situations. And so one organism that commonly grows in beef, a lot of times ground beef, is E. coli, and there's a special species or special subspecies, O157H7. And there have been outbreaks of this from time to time. My daughter was actually infected with this when she was 5, and we spent a good 4 or 5 days in the hospital. So it's not fun, but she recovered fine and did not have any complications like she maybe could have. And so there was an outbreak here at the Jack in the Box restaurant, which is a fast food restaurant, back in 1993. So I have a link here that you can't click on if you're listening to this, but you could definitely look this up and see some information about that. So 25 years ago that happened. And so basically this bacteria causes hemolytic diarrhea, and so it's basically killing parts of the intestine, and so bloody diarrhea is happening as well. It can actually lead to kidney disease and kidney failure, which my daughter did not have, but certainly I knew some people or knew some cases of children who were in the intensive care unit from this because they actually had progressed that far. So it can cause death, and in this case it caused the death of 4 children at the time. And so when it comes to the meat, maybe the restaurant workers didn't wash their hands properly so they could infect other food, or maybe the meat wasn't cooked properly as well. So cooking process, washing hands properly, these are all things that are very preventable, but just maybe didn't happen. So also when it comes to processed meat, things that have a lot of preservatives added to it can attract microbes that can be pretty hardy. And so there are some, bacteria that the ones that produce endospores, they can survive in these drier conditions and whatnot. And so they are the ones that are a little more dangerous sometimes because they can actually, then once they're hydrated again, they can multiply, and they can produce all these toxins, and these toxins can cause all kinds of different problems as well. So something like Clostridium botulinum, that produces endospores, and then the bacteria itself can produce toxins, which are nerve toxins, and can cause paralysis and death. I remember this story here, maybe it's a little bit older, but basically when I was younger, there was an outbreak at the mall where I lived in Peoria, Illinois. There was a restaurant there, and people got sick with this botulism infection. And so I can't remember the exact details, but basically it was kind of a big thing, and the restaurant had to shut down. But it was because probably the toxins were in the food, and the toxins are harder to kill as well, or the endospores were in the food, and those are harder to kill. And so the cooking process doesn't do these as well. When it comes to fish, fish can have a lot of microbes to begin with, and so raw fish can be a problem. A lot of times, if you look up examples of this, which you may not want to do, you can see like raw sushi, a lot of these parasites besides bacteria and fungi that we looked at can be passed on as well. So different tapeworms and all those good things that we studied last time also. Also, as far as fish, toxins can accumulate in their tissues. So the larger fish that are exposed to toxins in the water, they're around a lot longer, they get bigger and bigger, and the toxins build up. They don't necessarily get rid of these, and then we eat the toxins as well. And so there are a lot of things, like a lot of fish that can be frozen, that can kind of halt the process. Should be cooked, of course, in order to really ensure that it's microbe-free, but also salted and dried because of that osmotic pressure or the lack of water can be helpful too. And so there's some other issues here. Poultry and eggs. Raw eggs are not a good idea because they commonly carry salmonella. And so if they're cooked, usually not a problem. But if they're not, this disease can cause severe diarrhea, fever, vomiting, etc. And, it's definitely somebody can get over it, but if they get too dehydrated or their immune system is compromised or they're not able to get the correct treatment, can also lead to death. And so a lot of times you see, again, another picnic issue is when, potato salad or things that have mayonnaise in it are left out in these warm temperatures. And so maybe things were kept kind of at bay through a refrigerator. There might be a few microbes in there, but then those microbes start to multiply because they're in a temperature that they love. And so it's kind of dangerous to leave that food out for very long as well. Okay, milk, another issue. Usually inside of a cow, it's going to be sterile unless that cow has some sort of infection. But during the milking process is when it's exposed to microbes as far as when it leaves the actual cow. And then, putting everything in its containers and setting it through kind of its process that it goes through can pick up microbes along the way. Most milk is pasteurized, and so it's kind of heat shocked for a little bit of time. And that pretty much takes the numbers down, but still we need to make sure that things are refrigerated and not left out too long. Fruits and vegetables, just things usually crawling on their surfaces can be kind of an issue. The good news is this is usually pretty easy to see if it's causing the food to kind of get spoiled like we looked at before. Where we can't necessarily see it is something like where we maybe have some E. coli that's on it. We wash the fruit, but maybe we don't wash it very well. A lot of times things like sprouts can cause some problems because there may be bacteria in those sprouts. There's a lot of surface area. They're hard to wash. You're probably not doing a great job when you do that. And so a lot of times they can carry bacteria too that can be deadly. Grains and bakery products, we don't see this quite as much. Mold, definitely things can happen, but those fall under the less perishable of items for the most place. But there are some special types of fungi that can actually like to kind of grow in these environments as well. So Aspergillus and Claviceps are two of the genus names. They have more specific species names, but a lot of times these organisms release toxins, and so these toxins can be pretty dangerous, as you can see from some of the symptoms that are listed here. So grains and these bakery products are not always necessarily super safe. So as far as food preservation and what can be done, how can we actually be safe? Well, there's a couple things to kind of look at here as far as how things are stored and then what we want to do to make sure that they don't allow these microbes to grow very quickly. So one of these things that's often used is heat. And so when we look at if we're using moist heat, if you're cooking something, you're cooking something on the stove and it has a little bit of water content to it, that heat is going to break down proteins of microbes and they're probably going to die. If we don't quite heat it enough, then maybe we don't quite kill them off. The canning process is meant to completely get rid of microbes and sterilize it. So in this process, the food is going to be cleaned and sorted. It's going to be hit with a high temperature called blanching for about 3 to 5 minutes. It's going to kill most of the things. So once it's processed, it's put into a can. The can should be cleaned in the first place and sterilized, etc. And so then the air is removed, and if it doesn't have air, it doesn't have moisture, it has maybe this high salty environment, it's hard for things to grow. But again, kind of going back to things that can make endospores, can grow without oxygen, these are things that are going to be likely to grow as well. And so there's an example here of, it was back in the early 1900s, but there was a dinner party and someone had done their own canning, and the canning probably was not done properly, and 13 people that came to that party that night ended up dying from eating these endospores, from botulism. And so Clostridium botulinum was the bacteria there that caused that. So there was this mass funeral that had to happen. A lot of them were family members that died all at once. So this thermometer here kind of shows some different temperatures that we use for different processes, like the canning process, the cooking process, how we sanitize dishes, and whatnot. What I've put on here is kind of the danger zone. And so we have degrees Fahrenheit on the left side. If you're not as used to degrees Celsius, it's kind of easy to make this comparison when they're side by side. But basically this range here is where bacteria are going to grow their best. And so this is kind of the range. If I'm cooking my food and I get it kind of warm, but I get it up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit, that might be the best temperature that the bacteria likes to grow. And so I probably have killed nothing, and I probably have just made what was already there multiply, multiply, multiply. But once I get higher, past 120 up to 140, 160, those are the temperatures that kill. And so usually you would eliminate your bacteria in that case. But it's kind of scary because if you think about you're heating up food or something, if you don't quite make it warm enough, then you could actually be making it worse than maybe if you just ate it at room temperature, which probably isn't another good idea either. All right. Room temperature would actually be in the danger zone here, but maybe if you took it right out of the refrigerator, refrigerator temperature would be kind of in this range here as well. That's probably better than letting it sit out and eating it straight from there. But really everything should be warmed up properly. So when it comes to eating canned foods, I have kind of a list here of say no to. This is one of the early things I learned about when I was taking microbiology a long time ago, was about canned foods. And if you have dented cans, that means there may have been something that went wrong in the process, or that seal may be disrupted. And so even though sometimes those cans are sold at half price or whatnot, it's just not a good idea to buy those or to even use those, even if you have already bought them. If you open up a can and it kind of has a black ring at the top, that usually indicates that it has some sort of contamination. If a can is swollen, that means that there are microbes in there and they're producing gas, and that gas is making the can swell. So that's not a good idea. And if it just doesn't smell right, then it probably is not safe to eat. It's really not worth taking the chance. Usually canned foods aren't very expensive, so it's probably better to get rid of those rather than risk it. And another thing, you should always rinse your cans before opening, and probably this goes to pop cans and beer cans and whatnot, but because you don't know what's kind of getting on those outside of those cans in a factory. It may not be microbial contamination, but it may be dust, it may be dirt, it may be, feces, other things that are kind of floating around there as well. So always a good idea to kind of give them a good rinse and a wipe before you physically put your mouth to anything or open anything. If you open up a can with a can opener, usually the lid falls into the can. If something's on that lid, it can get into the food. So it's not hard to do. It's generally a good thing to do. So more heat here, pasteurization. Pasteurization is where there's quick heat and a quick amount of heat. There's different ways to do that, different temperatures and different times, but it kills most of the microbes. It doesn't have to kill everything, but it definitely is going to kill some and kind of allow them not, they're always going to have some microbes in some of our foods, but then not allow them to grow very rapidly. Other measures here, low temperatures, refrigeration. Most bacteria, except for those psychrotrophs that really like that temperature, most times bacteria are going to at least slow down in the refrigerator or stop multiplying. Doesn't mean it's going to kill them. Freezing sometimes can kill them, but they can still even stay alive. But it's definitely, they're not going to multiply. So if I put food that has 10 bacteria in the refrigerator, well, those 10 are probably going to stay put and not multiply into 20 and 40 and 80, etc. Drying, again, cells need water to grow, so drying it and taking out that water can prevent things from growing also. And there's a special technique called lyophilization, which is freeze drying. So drying it pretty quickly and then vacuuming out the water and removing that water from there is also important. Osmotic pressure, I mentioned things that are in a salty or sugary environment. If there are microbes in there, those microbes are going to lose their water and then they're going to die. So they're going to try to balance out their environment. With the concentration, it's not going to work. They're going to end up shriveling up and dying off as well. Sometimes chemical preservatives are used, and so these actually work on kind of hitting at the heart of the membranes of microbes. Some of these are known to be pretty safe, but a lot of chemical preservatives that are out there, I'm not sure that I want to be eating all of those that are possibly in the food as well. I'd like to avoid preservative as much as I possibly can. Radiation is another way, using gamma rays. There's X-rays and ultraviolet rays. Gamma rays is a different wavelength, and that actually can kill off microbes by damaging their DNA. So it's kind of controversial. A lot of times people don't want to, eat food that has radiation applied to it. It's not supposed to cause any harm, but people don't like that term. So as far as preventing foodborne disease, a little clarification here between food infection and food intoxication. If somebody gets food intoxication, they are probably sick within a couple hours of eating a certain type of food. That's because they've actually consumed the toxin that a bacteria maybe secretes. The other case is food infection, where maybe you've eaten the bacteria and the bacteria has to multiply, and it's going to take a little bit of time for that bacteria to multiply so much that it causes these effects that could make somebody sick. And so still in a food infection, after the bacteria multiplies, it could also secrete a toxin and someone could become really sick from that as well. But kind of two cases where you're either sick from the bacteria itself or you're sick from the toxin that a bacteria has. Toxins in foods are harder to kill off, so the cooking process may kill the actual bacteria but may not dismantle the chemicals that that bacteria is able to produce. And so somebody can get really sick. You probably all have had some sort of experience with food sickness or know somebody who has had food poisoning or whatnot. So a few tips to follow, and certainly there are probably a lot more than these. Don't leave out foods that should be refrigerated, so get those foods back to the refrigerator pretty quickly. Refrigerators should be set at about 4 or 5 degrees Celsius. If you kind of look at the scale over here, you can see that that ends up being around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. When my cat was trapped in the refrigerator for a good afternoon or morning when I was at work and he crawled in there and nobody noticed, everybody was so concerned that he, was going to die and he was going to freeze to death, except we kept saying, well, it wasn't a great situation, but it was not terrible because it's a refrigerator. So it's kind of like it was a cold day outside. There just was no light and no food, and he was stuck in there for several hours. So hopefully he learned his lesson. Thaw your meat in the refrigerator. It shouldn't just be sitting out to thaw all day, because again, if it goes to that sort of extreme, kind of warms up slowly, then the bacteria are going to start to grow and grow. Don't reuse cutting boards and utensils if there are potential pathogens on there. Don't use the same cutting board that you're cutting raw meat to then cut your vegetables, and make sure that that gets cleaned very well. Some things, you're cutting cheese, it's probably not a big deal, but other things are definitely going to have microbes on them before they're cooked. Refrigerate leftovers immediately and then reheat them to a good temperature above the danger zone. And any foods that are cooked in general get past that danger zone as well. So hopefully all of these things will, you'll learn something from this, and these tips will keep you safe. There's a quiz at the end of this chapter that's kind of interesting that you can take and see how you do. I never really thought too much before a few years ago about sort of, your kitchen sink and all the food that goes down into the sink, and there's probably a lot of microbes that are taking advantage of that. So I definitely clean my sink a little bit more than I used to, or run some hot soapy water down it quite a bit as well. I also had a student who did an honors project, and she swabbed her kitchen sink, and it was not pretty as far as how many bacteria and different molds and things were growing in there. So that's my other piece of advice for the day. All right, thank you.